guys. Hope you're having a great week. Today's Jesus habit is called stewardship. And so that's a weird word sometimes, just like last week we had a weird one, so we're going to explain that. And basically stewardship is managing the things that God has given you. It's being trustworthy with the things God has blessed you with. Usually when you say the word stewardship, you think of money, right? That's usually the go-to. And while it is, that's definitely a resource God has provided you with. You can also say that time and talents are things that God has blessed you with that you need to manage properly. The 3 T's, right? Time, talents, and treasure.
Yeah.
You guys heard of those? You know, God is so good. He's given us so many things we forget that He's given us sometimes. And oftentimes, talents, the things we're good at. You know, what has God blessed you with? Are you physically able to do some things that others can't? Maybe you're extremely smart and your mind works in ways that others can't. How do you use those things for God? And certainly your time. I mean, where do you spend your time is a huge thing. What is the most important thing to you? And of course, treasure, the gifts God's given you as far as resources. Stewardship is trusting in Him in those, and how do you manage the things He's given you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we talk about time and talent, treasure. We can't not talk about generosity, what it means to know that our God is a giving God. He's a generous God. Jesus talked a lot about how to not only manage our resources, but how important it is that we don't worship our resources, but that we are willing to give them away for the sake of the kingdom. This whole idea that we're not going to be locked in. In fact, Jesus said that oftentimes we can tell where our heart is by where we put our treasure. And He also said things like that you would ask a question like, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? You know, the fact that He comes before, you cannot serve both God and money. All words of Jesus. It's better to give than to receive. This whole idea of generosity and the fact that it made, we're sitting here, basically. We're able to worship in this place 2,000 years after Jesus because just decades and legacy of generosity through the years, starting with the early church. Maybe you've seen some examples of it, or what generosity means, stewardship. Guys, how what kind of things come to your mind when you hear these words?
Well, you mentioned the early church, and one of the things that I always think about is like in Acts chapter 2 and 4, this church that sacrificed for each other. It talks about how the believers, they would have everything in common, and when there was a need, they would sell stuff, and just all that stuff, it didn't matter in the face of knowing who God was. They trusted Him so much that they were willing to make these sacrifices for one another. And that's just, that's mind blowing to me. But I think that's the byproduct of really trusting God, is the willingness to make these sacrifices.
Trusting God. Yeah. And I'm not to go too deep with this, but I think, wow, the culture that the New Testament church in Acts 2 and Acts chapter 4 were in, where people were outcast, people were in need, people that, and the generosity of that early church actually was attractive, especially to outsiders who, it's just really amazing.
I think of the joy that giving is supposed to bring. And I know it doesn't always start off that way. So I felt like I had a clenched fist with some dollars or some time or some talents in it that I sometimes opened up and sometimes didn't. But the joy that comes along with being generous, or the joy that comes along with knowing that you're following one of Jesus' commands, or it's something I think gets developed alongside of that. And it's part of the process.
Yeah. When you look at that early Acts church, they would literally sell everything they owned. That's pretty impressive. I look back at the guys that spent time with me. I'm sitting here today because handfuls of guys spent time with me. They just took time out of their day and the talents they had, and they taught me how to be a better person.
Yeah. I don't think anyone here at this table has ever said, "No, God, stop being generous."
Right.
Don't
too generous.
Yeah. Like, how much is too much? We're just thankful for what we have and understand that it's a gift.
Yeah.
It's ours to manage and to take seriously, and and ask the Lord, how can we use this for your purpose instead of our own even.
Yeah. And just as a final thought to this, once again, going back to this idea that we are Christ followers, and the only reason that we can even have stewardship in our life is because stewardship was modeled to us by Christ, right? And perfect sacrifice and perfectly trusting God was modeled to us by the very man that we claim to follow, and we are supposed to become like him. Like that's the whole idea behind discipleship, right? Is we're developing these habits so the Spirit can transform us to be more like Christ. So my question is, how do we get there, right? Like how do we transition from, as Jeff talked about, having clenched fists and holding on to stuff to being open-handed and generous and sacrificial? How do we actually get there? Where are some of the things that you've seen or experienced that have helped you as in your path towards stewardship?
Yeah, so I've actually prayed to God about helping me to be humble, helping me to treat others as more important than myself, so that I can serve them. And serve them obviously includes the 3 T's: the time, the talents, and the treasure. Yeah, humility.
One of my prayers is, Patrick, you mentioned prayer is, God, if I'm not willing to give it away, take it away. Just test my heart on this. If I'm so, in love with this thing or this, even above you, then it's become sinful, and I don't want that a part of my life. And he's made it pretty clear. I know a lot of generous people that don't follow Jesus.
Yeah.
You can be generous and not be a Christ follower, but you can't be a Christ follower and not be generous. It's
Very, very true.
Outside of, I know a lot of this discussion, people just think about putting money into an offering plate or giving money to the church when they think about this, but I think about moving through the community, walking through a normal day, but allowing the Holy Spirit to point stuff out, because it's not just about giving at the church, but giving to anyone, especially in the community. So as we walk around through our normal day, our normal schedule, just saying, how can I be helpful? How can I be generous to whoever I might bump into today? But asking God for some help and guiding and directing those.
Yeah, Jeff, how do you know what to say yes to and what to say no to? Because people are always asking, it feels like there's always someone wanting, or some need to meet. How do you know what to respond to that?
It's prayer, right?
That's where it starts. And I guess, are we ever going to be wrong for being too generous? If we have this generous God who's modeled perfect generosity to us, is God, when we get to the end of our lives, is God going to be like, no, you were too generous? Like,
right.
Are we ever going to get there? And so sometimes I would just say, start giving, and then pray for discernment, right? Pray for God to give you some clarity about how that giving looks like. But you got to start, and I think a lot of times, sometimes I think we let questions hold us back. We're like, we let we hamper the generosity that God's trying to help grow in our lives by asking these sorts of questions. And sometimes it just starts with getting out there and doing it, and then seeing where God takes you after that.
I think to properly understand that is like Jeff mentioned, at the end of the day, guys, it's all God's. Every bit of it is God's in the first place. And if he's let us use it for a while we're here, it's the better understanding on what this stewardship really is.
Absolutely. So just to recap some of the things that we talked about, we talked about seeing people through God's eyes, having the prayer that we would see people as God sees them, understanding who God is and that he is Lord of all of this stuff, and so it doesn't hurt us to trust him and give it away. These are how you begin developing that habit of stewardship in your life. And one last thing I want to throw out there is just, like I said, start. Like all habits, you've got to start somewhere. Set aside some money, devote some time. Say, God, this is yours. How can I best use this to build your kingdom? Start asking those type of questions, and I think that you're going to find that God has all kinds of ideas for how you can actually grow his kingdom with the stuff that he has placed into your life.
I know as part of our, we talk about resources quite a bit, especially when we're talking about our basics and how to start out. Sometimes it's hard to say yes to giving, and maybe you have a number in mind, Josh. I don't know. The Bible talks a lot about the 10%, the tithe. But it's hard to even imagine that unless we've created some margin, unless we've, learned how to manage our money on a very practical day-to-day basis, which is why I appreciate some of the things we do here at CCW, like Financial Peace University.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in small groups, maybe asking people who are modeling generosity, how do you do this? I asked Jeff that question earlier for a reason, because Jeff's a generous person, and I want, it's a good question to ask. How do you know? Ask people smarter than you, how does this really look on a real life basis? Because I know a lot of us are going, whoa. I was good up until today when you started talking about giving my money away. You know, so maybe the word like investment is good. You know, I kind of think about that, investing in others.
So like kingdom investment.
Yeah, yeah, and that may have to do with our challenge for this week. So
we do have one. It's called the Stewardship Challenge. You should have some of these at your table with you. Just real quick, there's lots of words, but there is a short study, so you can go into this a little bit deeper. There's some reflection questions that will help you apply the study that you did. And then there's several challenges that are attached to that. And part of this is if you have not experienced this part of your relationship with God and are headed there for the first time, we know it can be scary. We know you might not know where to start. We believe that the Stewardship Challenge will help you get there, particularly with giving money to the church for the first time. We do have a challenge set up that we believe that God's going to be faithful and he's going to take care of you. And so if for the first time, if giving isn't something that has been a habit that you've developed, you can read through this challenge and you can see how maybe for the first time you can start to give and see how God responds.
Absolutely. So you're going to talk a little bit about trusting God and this idea of stewardship, and we'll see you next week.